So I want to ask the question about whether we can restore real rivers in cities. And this question comes about just because I think that we often have, we're okay, we recognize that we're very constrained in what we can do in many urban areas. And that's, reality to be recognized and accounted for. But I don't think it means that we just get out of the game. I think we need to be clever and look for opportunities to go ahead and try to do what we can, restore where we can. Um, so along that line, let me just start with these basic ideas that it's natural river processes, dynamic channels that create the habitats that we are usually trying to restore to. So these ecological values depend on the natural river processes. That includes, of course, the flow of water, but also the transport of sediment and nutrients and organic matter. And the complexity of the habitat will depend on the geomorphology, which of course depends on the flow, sediment load, geologic setting, the climate, and so on. And I think it's a live question in many cases of can we restore these processes in urban areas? Okay, one technical question for you all. Do you see the shadow of the toolbar across? Is that interfering with you being able to read the slides?
No, we can read the slides just fine.
Okay, so I think it's only for me, so I won't worry about it. Okay, so in more rural landscapes, we have more room. It's easier to let the river do its thing without interference. And so we can have this dynamic channel movement that then creates our habitats. Excuse me, somebody's using a jackhammer outside. I'm going to close the door. Okay. That should be better. So this is just an example. We have a actively eroding meander bend on the Sacramento River. It's creating vertical, cohesive banks, which are great habitat for bank swallows and other organisms. And as the bank continues to erode, these trees will fall in, creating complexity. And meantime, back of the ranch on the other side of the channel, we are building a point bar. So the dimensions of the channel will probably stay more or less the same as it migrates across the bottomland. But on the opposite bank, it's building a point bar, which is then a suitable surface for colonization by pioneer plants. So it's this dynamic movement of the channel that gives us a lot of the complexity that we're really after in river restoration projects. Now, there are some places where you can't, even if you gave the river room, it wouldn't be able to do much for itself because it doesn't have the energy and the sediment load. You need both the room for the river to be able to function, move around, and flood, and the energy. And this is an example of a river that obviously has the energy. It's the Walla Walla River in eastern Washington. As you can probably see on this image from the 1960s, the Army Corps of Engineers corrected, as the term used to be, this river. It took it from a sinuous pattern and made it nice and straight with levees along the sides. Then in a subsequent flood, the river had the energy to erode those levees, and you can see it's been restoring a meandering pattern through here. So this river would be a great candidate to restore itself if you just said, okay, the Army Corps straightened it. We want to bring it back to a more natural pattern, more heterogeneous habitat. Just set the levees back and give it room. And in the next flood, it's going to create natural forms. And this also relates to another factor we can think about, which is hydrologic and ecological connectivity. Um, so that's defined often as the water-mediated transfer of matter, energy, and organisms within or between elements of the hydrologic cycle. So water going from the channel to the floodplain, organisms, juvenile fish living inside channels in the floodplain. And as they get older or it's time to migrate, they'll swim out in the main channel and go up or down the main channel. So it's these dimensions of connectivity, longitudinal, up and downstream, lateral, channel to the floodplain, and vertical, surface and groundwater. These are what we call the connectivity dimensions, and they are so critical in restoring the habitats. And then we can adapt this framework of connectivity from environmental science to this idea of social connectivity, which is the movement and communication of people and goods and ideas and culture along and across rivers. And again, that's the same dimensions that we apply in hydrology and ecology, we can apply from a social point of view, looking at rivers and their social connectivity. And these social interactions are especially intense in urban areas where you have a concentration of people right along the rivers. Well, if we want to restore some natural process to the river and some natural habitats, the ideal is to create a river corridor. Give the river a zone within which it can freely flood and erode and deposit. And as the waters come up, it reconnects secondary channels and impinges on the banks and creates all these complicated flow patterns. It inundates the floodplains, and juvenile fish can feed and occupy and grow big on the floodplains. So this is the idea. You give the river a corridor. You keep your human structures, infrastructure, and so you keep that out of that corridor. And so if the river has a big flood and tears up the bottomland, it doesn't matter because you're out of the way. You're just, staying out of a bad neighborhood, basically. You leave the river its space. And this concept is increasingly adopted, especially in Europe, but there are different terms for it, the espace de liberté or erodible corridor or fluvial territory. In Bavaria, they talk about elbow room for the river. In the US, in Washington State, they have a whole program for channel migration zones. In Vermont, they call it the streamway. Um, and I want to emphasize this is different from what was often called room for the river in Netherlands, because that's basically just for floodwaters, some place to park the floodwaters. They're at the downstream end of the Rhine River Basin, and they are inundated with water. They need places where they can shunt the water off to until things calm down and they can, drain it back off again. They're not necessarily trying to get fluvial erosion and deposition. That's not their aim. They're not trying to create a dynamic river per se. So, my observation is that it's often assumed that real river processes are not possible in cities. And often that's true, but when it's not, this assumption prevents us from recognizing opportunities. And there's some structural reasons why this tends to be the case. Riverfront revitalization efforts are typically run by the economic development department of a city. The people there, they're well-intentioned, they're going to create nice things in terms of the economy, but they have no expertise in ecology or fluvial processes, and usually very little motivation to prioritize ecological goals. As long as they can make it pretty, that's all they need. And as a result, many riverfront development projects have created what I would call fake rivers. Um, an example, um, new cities, new districts of cities need rivers. And if they aren't there to begin with, we'll make them. Now, things have really quieted down in China in terms of the development boom, but for the first 20 years of the 21st century, Chinese cities were just booming like crazy. Um, and the way they would typically expand is they would they would build a new district. And here's an example of the city of Tiling. They were creating this new district, the Fanhe district. Um, and they and the cities in Beijing, most of them want to qualify as what's called a landscape garden city. And there are different criteria that you have to meet in order to qualify as a landscape garden city. But when you do, it's a nice designation, and there's certain funds you can access, things like that. So it's very difficult to retrofit the existing part of the city to meet these guidelines. It's usually there are certain measurements of how much uh, public space you have alongside a water body is one of the criteria. And that means, where you have a river in your city, you want to make parkland along it. You want to connect that. You want to have continuous trails and easy access to the neighborhoods around. So it's very difficult to retrofit, but if you're building a new district, of course, you're going to focus a lot of your recreational amenities along the rivers that are there. But what if you don't have a river? No problem. We will dig one. And so this is what happened in this city, Tiling. You can see this is the new district, and no river, but they excavated a series of ponds that were basically elongated ponds that created the visual impression of a river. Another kind of faux river that you could identify would be the dammed and the regulated. And this is pretty common in dry climates or other places where you have very seasonal flow regimes. Rivers will dry out in the non-rainy season, or nearly so. And that seasonal pattern of having a dry riverbed part of the year and too much water the rest is not really attractive to most people, and certainly to managers trying to create a certain look and a certain ambiance. So in many cities, there's an interest in having stabilized water levels, or just having some water there all year long. This is in Phoenix and Tempe, and this is Tempe Town Lake. So this is the Salt River, which normally flows like this when it flows, and so there's the dam built here that impounds this. Well, it's like a small reservoir in the channel of the Salt River, and this happens to be right at the Arizona State campus. So this is actually quite a typical kind of response to a dry, seasonally dry riverbed. The water for this comes from, well, there's some water in the Salt River, but they also import river from another drainage nearby. What else to say about this? Um, the the Guadalupe River in San Jose, um, that was that there were proposals to build dams in the Guadalupe River to impound water like this as well all year round. It was after the city fathers of San Jose visited the uh, the San Antonio River in San Antonio, Texas, and they loved it. They loved the river walk there, and they came home and said, "We want to do the same thing." Well, problem is it's a very seasonal flow regime in San Antonio River or in Guadalupe River. San Antonio River is spring fed, and especially at that time, it was still heavily spring fed. Um, so anyway, so that was a proposal for the Guadalupe, was to put in 2 or 3 dams and back the water up. Fortunately, that was nixed because of the impact on steelhead migration. Okay, so more examples. This is the Tulan Mulan River in Ordos City, Inner Mongolia. And here's what the river looked like. The river was there. There was a river, but it wasn't big enough and it wasn't year round. So they built a series of dams and created these big water features that, are now like the centerpiece of the urban form. And of course, this is a very dry climate, just like Tempe, Arizona. So you build a fake river reservoir like this, and you're going to lose a lot of water through evapotranspiration. So let's move on to an example that integrates a couple of different kinds of fake rivers, all rolled into one. It's the Sabarmati River in Ahmedabad, India. This is in Gujarat, and when this project was done, Modi, the current prime minister, was the executive officer of this part of the country. And so this was a kind of a grand, um, how should I say, it's making Ahmedabad into a world-class city. That was the whole idea here. What did they do? So here's the Sabarmati River flowing through the center of Ahmedabad. And this is what it naturally looks like. In most of the year, it's a dry, mostly dry riverbed with a small channel going through. After in the early 2000s, a dam was built. So this is very much like Tempe Town Lake. They backed the water up through the downtown. So now you have a year-round stagnant water in the center of the city. Um, so there's more about this, but okay, where's the water support? Where is the water coming from? That's the question. If you look up here, this is a canal that goes from the Narmada River down to feeding irrigation areas elsewhere. So it was a major water transfer. So they just tapped into that. They created this diversion from the Narmada Canal that would feed the Sabarmati River. And it didn't need that much since the dam was down here impounding it. So that's kind of the big picture aerial view. This is what the river looked like before this change. And you can see it was very heavily used by the local people, the local poor people who didn't matter anything at all. They were just down here doing their daily thing. But this was the vision that was sold by the project proponents to make it like the Thames embankment of the late 19th century. Um, and they use this image on the bottom as part of selling the project. Um, and this is the result. They transformed that messy river scene that you saw into this clean, um, sanitized place for rich people. Now, part of this also included narrowing the river um, and creating land on that fill for expensive hotels and expensive apartments and things like that. So they wound up displacing about 40,000 residents of settlements along the river, some formal, some informal. And the people were using the river for, all these daily uses, washing clothes and watering their livestock and everything. Um, and the city had formerly had a lot of manufacturing plants which had closed. So a lot of the people living along the river, they were involved in kind of the market economy. There were these markets, and they would go and sell at the markets, and they would be involved in all this commerce. But you have to be in the center of the city to access that. 14,000 of the displaced residents were moved to a new settlement that was like an hour outside of the city in a kind of a mosquito infested swamp. Uh, Nothing for them to do economically. So it was, there were a lot of sad equity concerns that came up with this. But it's another example of a river with imported water um, and kind of a fake river because it's impounded and it stays the same all year long. Well, staying with this theme of fake rivers that are rely on foreign waters, probably the best known example of daylighting in the world, certainly the most cited example in the literature, is the Chong in Seoul. So this, my former PhD student Kristen Wilson and I call this a wonderful example of a linear fountain, but not a stream restoration. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the story of the Chong. This is a map showing the Chong stream is this one. It flows into this tributary whose name I forget, and then that then joins the Han River, which is one of the major drainages in Korea down here, which goes all farther off to the left and into the sea. So the Chong is why Seoul, the capital of Korea, was built where it was. It was the feng shui of the mountains to the north and the mountains to the south, and then the west to east flowing river. Um, so so Seoul was settled here, but during the Korean War, um, things got pretty bad. And the river was polluted, and there were shanties along the creek here, along the channel. So those were all removed and things were cleaned up. The river was put into a culvert and concrete was put over the top, and it was a road. And then that was started off just as a surface street, and then they added an elevated expressway on top of it. So it was quite transformed. And it was that way for, let's say, 30 or 40 years. And then there was a mayor in Seoul who had this vision to open up the creek to daylight it, and which was a very interesting and successful idea. And here you see the remnants of that elevated expressway, some of the supports that were retained as kind of a historical reminder. But most of the system looks something like this, where you've got water flowing down a straight channel and then willows on the banks. Not everywhere. There's different sections that look differently, but mostly it's sort of like this. And as I say, this is a recent review of daylighting papers in the scientific literature found this was by far and away the most cited daylighting project and most described. And I have to say, from a social connectivity point of view, this is a fabulous success. I mean, people are down here all the time. They're enjoying it. Office workers have their lunch. People get married down here. It's a very important social space for the city, very successful. And it pretty much always looks like this, steady flow. Now, how does it work? Um, the designers didn't want to have a seasonal flow in this creek. Naturally, Chong would have the opposite flow regime that we have in coastal California. It would be dry in the wintertime and it would be raging floods in the summer. Well, they didn't want that. They wanted to have a steady flow through this important urban area. So they pump water from the Han River several kilometers to go into the Chong and flow through this channel. So this channel again was opened up from what was formerly in a culvert, an underground culvert, and so now it's got this artificial source of water. Of course, there's still rain falling on the catchment of the Chong, the watershed. That's all shunted into culverts that are on either side of this channel here. So you don't have to see that dirty runoff from the urban area. Okay, So we have the water pumped from the Han River. It's flowing down the channel. Uh, the Han River has a lot of agriculture in its drainage basin, and they use a lot of chemicals, including all these fertilizers. So there's a lot of nutrients in the water. So you have shallow water flowing over this rocky bed with sunlight. What do you get? Algae. Well, the managers didn't like the algae. So they have a crew, well, actually more than one crew, that are full-time scraping the algae off the rocks during the season in which algae are growing, the warmer months. Um, so that's kind of unusual for a stream restoration project. You wouldn't really consider that. Um, and they have a lot of still, even with this algae removal, they have a lot of toxic blooms that occur. Now they've spent all this money. I forget how many million they spend a year just pumping the water from the Han River to go into the Cheonggyecheng. Um, and that water would just infiltrate into the bed and go into the local groundwater. Well, we spent so much money pumping the water up, we don't want to lose it to infiltration. So there is an impermeable layer under those stones. The stones you see on the bed are basically just resting on this impermeable layer. So, um, so no more vertical connection with the shallow groundwater. Um, so we can ask the question, has hydrologic and ecological connectivity been restored? Well, certainly the the ecology is much better now than it was. I mean, there are fish living in this, I don't know, stream. Do you call it a stream? I don't know, flowing aquarium. Um, and you have willows and so on. That's all great. And it's a great improvement over being in a dark tunnel. But it's not really river restoration. Social connectivity, again, a great success. Human access, of course, is improved because before you couldn't even touch it or see it. It was buried. But we would say this is not really anymore a real stream. Now, what would we like to see in urban areas? Not very often celebrated, but I think a wonderful uh, bit of land use planning is the American River Parkway, which goes back to 1959. And it's 37 kilometers long, so whatever, 25 miles or something like that from Nimbus Dam down to the Sacramento River confluence. It's got trails of various kinds. It still supports spawning salmon. Now, of course, there's a hatchery at the just below Nimbus Dam, so these are almost all, of course, hatchery fish, but there's some wild fish that go in there. And you've got a dynamic river environment here, and it's very very effective, and it gives a lot of capacity for managing large floods. So this is a corridor that was set aside. Of course, there are various things that have to be dealt with, but it's not like you have to maintain it. It's basically a river, and a river maintains itself, just as it's done for thousands of years. So now let's look at another example of integrating real river processes in an urban area. This is the Isar River in Munich, which was formerly canalized. It had rocks lining the base of these banks, and it was a straight shot, and that's what you had. Not very many places for people to get down to the river, um, with these essentially vertical banks. And the habitat was pretty boring. It was basically just a big ditch. Well, that was changed in the first decade of the 21st century. Big restoration project undertaken, and the river was widened. The banks were made erodible. Gravel was added upstream of the city because before it had been gravel starved because of dams upstream. Now they're actually adding gravel to the system. And they also cleaned up the water quality. There were two villages upstream on the Isar that had inadequate sewage treatment. And so there was always an E. coli or risk of contamination for people going in the water. Those were cleaned up. That was a key part of this project. And um, one thing that I find inspiring about this is that you look at these natural river forms throughout the city like this. These gravels were added to the river upstream. They were transported downstream and deposited in these natural bar forms. Um, and in addition, the river overall was widened from an average of 50 to 90 meters. Um, so it's this combination of some interventions that are designed to interact with the high flows to produce the heterogeneous habitat that you want in the end. Now, of course, here the habitat is being occupied by Homo sapiens, but there are many different parts of this river where again, if you go there during a weekend in July, a sunny weekend in July, which I highly recommend, it's inspiring. There's 8 kilometers long of these amazing features that are heavily, heavily used. You'll see thousands of people using these gravel bars to recreate and swimming and whatnot. Um, so and it's quite easy for people to get down. There are by lowering the banks and expanding the whole footprint of the river and its corridor. There are lots of places where people can access the river easily. So this was an amazing project, and the official price tag was 32 million for 8 kilometers of the river, which is breathtaking. Now that doesn't take into account all the planning efforts. So there was literally a decade of meetings of of scientists from the state of Bavaria and the city of Munich and the federal government and the NGOs and university staff and students. There was a lot of planning that went into this, a lot of community engagement. But at the end, they came up with a great plan, and they were able to create, to me, just an amazing feature. And it's right in the heart of the city. That's the point. And it also, I should also mention it that by expanding the river, they also included in the project raising the flood walls. So now they have a much greater capacity to manage floods than before, but both by widening the whole footprint and raising the flood walls. Those two things improve their flood conveyance capacity. Another river in a dense urban area is the Air River in Geneva. I think it's a great example of what we could call a limited espace de liberté. It's in right around the air. It's designated as an agricultural zone, but this is like a little island within this urban area. So there's tremendous pressure on this site. Um, so in the late 19th and early 20th century, 3 kilometers of the air were corrected. That was the term, rectification. So it was a meandering channel and it was turned into a nice straight one. So here's a view of the canal before the uh, the the restoration project. The 1997 water law for the Canton of Geneva called for the restoration of the Air River, but it didn't say exactly how that was to be done. There were a lot of proposals, and most of them involved obliterating all trace of this canal and putting in big meanders. Um, the 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 approach that was selected uh, came from a group called Superpositions, led by Georges Descombes, a very insightful landscape architect in Geneva, who works with his son in their ADR Architects is their office in Geneva. And their approach was to leave the canal, modify it, adapt it so that it would provide places for people to gather and recreate. And basically, the human uses would be concentrated along there, which would leave this area to the south. So they were able to, they made this proposal and it was approved that they would get a 200-meter wide corridor to the south, cutting into the agricultural lands down here. And so they were able to let the river utilize this corridor area to create its own channel. This was the key idea. They didn't want to impose a channel. They wanted to let the river do that itself. So they proposed this multi-channel template in which the air could choose its own course by excavating channels and leaving islands behind, which we called lozenges. So here's how they explain the concept to the public. They use the analogy of a bar of Swiss chocolate over which you pour hot milk. And the hot milk erodes out a channel within these smaller channels, this grid of channels that existed before. And this is what was done. On the left, you see the chocolate bar ready for the hot milk. So this is this grid of channels excavated into the floodplain. And, a lot of this was just very practical. The width of these channels was the width of the blade of their tractor. And the depth, we went back and forth on that quite a bit, but mostly it's meter to meter and a half in depth. And then, as you can kind of see here, you have different materials. You have silts and you have gravels. That's more gravel there, more silt there. And as you could predict, these different materials responded very differently to flows. So this is what it looked like before any flows, and this is what it looked like after a year. And during that year, there was not even a 1.5 year flow. I think it was less than that. So it was relatively modest flows, but there was quite a response in the channel. And we can see that more from these drone images. For the first 2 years, there were repeat drone flights every few months, and we'll zero in a little more detail. The first drone flight before any flows, where you just have the chocolate bar cut out here in July 2014. After 1 year, you can see that the river is starting to find its course here. And but it still hasn't decided, which channel it's going to occupy in here. And then by 1 year later, it's pretty much made up its mind. So here's the river flowing through like this, right? So through this process of allowing the river to make its channel, but giving it the tools and giving it all this erodible sediment with which to build bars and to sculpt its forms. I find it's a great example of process restoration. So you encourage and allow the river process to form and shape the channel. And so I think from both the ESAR and the air examples, we can see that even in these dense urban environments, in some places it's possible to restore real river processes, but we have to recognize those opportunities. When the Canton of Geneva passed this new water law, 1997, to restore the Aire River, many of their proposals involved beautiful meander bends that were going to be locked in place because you've just created a perfect meander bend. You don't want to change it. You don't want it to change. So I think it was really fortunate that the opportunity to let the air evolve on its own was recognized, and it's created a really ecologically very productive habitat. Now, have a look at this place. This is an opportunity in an urban area, but it's not what you would expect. If you were just parachuted in here, you might think you were in Utah or something, but in fact, you're in the heart of Los Angeles, in the Sepulveda flood control basin. So here's Sepulveda Basin, right in the heart of San Fernando Valley. And when you look at where it is on the LA River system, the Los Angeles River headwaters are here in the western edge of the San Fernando Valley. It flows like this. It picks up Tahunga Wash and other tributaries. Going here through Glendale Narrows, this is an area where, because the bedrock is close to the surface, water is pushed to the surface. And so these are what are called the soft bottom reaches, where they were unable to put concrete on the bed of the river because of all these upward forces from the groundwater rising to the surface. So you have the soft bottom reach, and then, of course, continue down. This lower part of the river is pretty much a perfect concrete trapezoidal channel. But here you see where the Sepulveda Basin is located. It was one of two flood control basins built by the Army Corps of Engineers in the mid-20th century. This and then Hansen Dam up here on Tahunga Wash is another big flood control basin. Now, I think it's interesting to look at this place in context. Sepulveda Basin is this patch of green in the city, but mostly in the city, you look and you've got this kind of pattern, these concrete ribbons. This one is Highway 101. What highway is this? This is the Los Angeles River. So this is, Terminator 2 highway. But it is interesting from above. It's hard to identify that as even being the river. And again, here's Sepulveda Basin in its context. So it's quite an amazing patch of green for this urban area. It was built by the Corps of Engineers to detain floodwaters. And this is how it performs during floods. It backs the water up and then gradually releases the flow through the dam. So there's really a unique opportunity here at Sepulveda. This is one place where you could let the Los Angeles River have a real corridor to flood and to migrate and erode and deposit. I want to go back to this other image here. Yeah, this one. This is the Los Angeles River, but look at how you've got buildings right up to the edge. There's no wasted space here. You have all these encroachments coming right up to the edge. So there's very little opportunity to widen the system without enormous expense. Currently, the river is confined to a narrow channel within this basin. And there are various other uses. Here's a model aircraft field. There's a big water treatment plant. There's a National Guard armory here, or a camp of some kind. Another kind of sports complex. There's this big lake, recreational lake, which takes treated wastewater. But mostly, the biggest single use here is by far golf. The river project, led by the late Melanie Winter, undertook a restoration feasibility study for Sepulveda in 2022, asking the question, can we improve flood risk reduction? Can we expand a dynamic river corridor and give public access to the natural river and floodplain? And most important recommendations from this included lowering the floodplain adjacent to the river, giving the river a wide natural corridor for channel migration, and also it would increase the flood storage. So there'd be quite a bit of earth that would be removed to expand this corridor, um, but in the end, you would increase the flood storage capacity. And the idea is this natural river could then be a point of attraction for the people in this area. It'd be an important parkland that could appeal to many, many different age groups. That feasibility study was followed by the city's vision plan. And the vision plan embraced this idea of a wider river corridor. It talks quite a bit about dynamic channel processes, but there are a lot of questions that were not resolved in this vision plan, such as how wide the river corridor should be. The plan mostly and understandably to avoid political entanglements and fights, defer to the existing land uses and assume that these three 18-hole golf courses would stay in the basin. But perhaps this is worth revisiting. When you think about the San Fernando Valley and Sepulveda Basin within it, Sepulveda could be like the Central Park of the San Fernando Valley. It's a huge open space. It's similar scale to Central Park in New York. So here's the Sepulveda Basin, and here's Central Park to the same scale. Now imagine devoting such a high percentage of Central Park to golf, which is basically an exclusive use. So this is how much Central Park would be taken up if you move the golf courses to there. And in fact, there was a proposal in the 60s to put golf in Central Park. The Parks Commissioner, Newbold Morris, rejected the idea, saying, how can we have this in Central Park without hitting people in the heads with golf balls? And of course, that's why it's an exclusive use. If you have this as a golf course, you don't allow the people around to come and use it, even though these areas around the Sepulveda Basin have among the lowest area of parkland per person in the basin, in the city of Los Angeles. So there's actually a lot of need for parks. These areas in red are very high parkland deficit. So that if they could just get to the park and use that land, that would be a tremendous benefit. But most of this is off limits because it's part of golf courses. Now the city is still in the process of trying to plan what to do, and they're exploring options to redesign the golf courses, which would allow more room for the river. So we have our hopes that this process will produce a bigger corridor available for the Los Angeles River. Now we know that if we can give the river room, we know it has the energy to create its own natural forms. Here's an aerial view of the river. It's got big meander bend here, another one upstream that are cutting into some of the surrounding land uses. In others, this is showing us that the river has the energy to create its meander bends. And when we contrast this with what most of the Los Angeles River looks like, which is concrete channel. This is the LA River near Compton. So most of the focus on restoration so far has been in the soft bottom reaches, like here in Glendale Narrows. So, you know, this is the reach where they could not put in a concrete bottom because of the rising groundwater, which would just lift those concrete slabs up. So this, of course, creates, in terms of flood conveyance point of view, this is a lot of hydraulic roughness. This really slows the water down and limits how much you can carry in this channel. Nonetheless, these are the areas where the focus is now on restoration, because you start off with a much better palette of opportunity with the soft bottom. But Uh, you're still, even if you're in soft bottom, you still have buildings right up to the edge or freeways. You still are highly constrained. It would be astronomically expensive to double or triple the width of this channel by cutting into whatever the uses are adjacent. Whereas within the Sepulveda Basin, um, it's never going to be developed. It's just there to accommodate big floods. You could really give the river a nice wide corridor and create a bit of wildness in the city. Tremendous potential here for recreation, education, wildlife, and improved flood risk reduction. Now, this is just one example, but I think there are probably many others that we could find if we look closely and with an open mind at our river systems. And in Contra Costa, we're fortunate that we have the 50-year plan to restore concrete channels to natural channels. So that's a policy that was adopted by the district board, which of course are the supervisors. This was over 10 years ago now. There's been some work done to identify opportunities, and some opportunities have been taken, but it's a big task, and there's lots still to be done. But I would say, we probably should be focusing more on finding low-hanging fruit and thinking long-term. This was Mitch Avalon's vision. Let's think long-term. It's called a 50-year plan because if you try to do this in the next few years, there's no way. But if you think about it as a long-term evolution, you could put policies in place that would, in fact, make it possible in coming decades to convert some of these concrete channels to natural channels. So, in conclusion, I would say it's often challenging to restore real river processes in cities. And that's why we see lots of fake rivers in cities. But there are opportunities, and we should take them where we can, and we should try to give the rivers some room. So thanks for your attention.